Good morning. Let me tell you about a kid from the North Beach area of San Francisco. Born in 1928, grew up heavily influenced by his two uncles, both of whom were leaders of big bands in the area. Became a very popular kid by the time he hit high school because everybody wanted him at the party because he played such stylish boogie-woogie on the piano. Served in the Korean War. Came back to San Francisco in the early 1950s, started carving out a career for himself as a jazz pianist. Spent some time working with a young Cal Chater in one of the latter's first trios. Carved around a lot, did some woodshedding, picked up his own trio, began performing at the Hungry Eye with his good friends Dean Riley on bass and Eddie Duran on guitar. Somewhat unusual trio configuration because you'll notice the absence of drums. Nat King Cole had a similar trio at about that time. During Guaraldi's period at the Hungry Eye, he and his buddies gained a contract at Fantasy Records, recorded 2 albums, neither of which sold very well. And so Guaraldi's 3-album contract at Fantasy Records was terminated at the end of the second album. Went on the road with Woody Herman. In 1956, as a member of Woody Herman's Third Herd, toured the United States, came back to San Francisco, did some more time on his own, both as a sideman in other groups, rejoined Cal Chater, at the time fronting a quintet, spent about 2 years there, joined Woody Herman again in 1959 when the latter took his band overseas to England in sort of a cross-cultural presentation that later became known as Woody Herman's Anglo-American Herd. They cut 1 album overseas in England. Almost nobody is aware of it. It's never been reproduced on CD. I have a copy. Made a splash as a sideman in Chater's band at the 1958 Monterey Jazz Festival, the very first one. But unfortunately, in those days, in the late 1950s, making a splash as a sideman didn't mean much, because this was a time period when sidemen often weren't even mentioned on album covers. Guaraldi wanted his own career, and sadly, it was kind of rapidly going nowhere until fate intervened. And a film hit the United States in December of 1959, a foreign film given the American title Black Orpheus, which became extremely popular on these shores, mostly because of its luxurious soundtrack, bossa nova soundtrack by Antonio Carlos Jobim and Louis Bonfa. Enormously popular music, and the timing was right. That film and a couple of other performers, Stan Getz being one of the other jazz guys, helped usher in what became the bossa nova movement in the early 1960s in the United States. Guaraldi loved the music in the film Black Orpheus, and he sat down and did some of his own arrangements of the film's 4 primary themes. Thought it was a great idea for an album, pitched it to Capitol Records. They turned him down. Pitched it to Columbia Records. They turned him down. With no other options, he went back to Fantasy, talked to Max Weiss, who was heading Fantasy at the time, pitched the concept to Max. Max thought about it, said, okay, I'll give you a 1-record deal, but there's a catch. You have to pay for the studio time. Okay, there's a Charlie Brown moment. Guaraldi recorded the album with what became his second famous trio, Monty Budwig on bass, Colin Bailey on drums. When it came time to plan a single, Max Weiss naturally wanted to put one of the Black Orpheus themes on the A side. Guaraldi had no objection to that. But there'd only been enough music from Black Orpheus to fill 1/2 of the album. So on the second side of the album, Guaraldi covered a couple of pop tunes and then wrote a couple of his own originals. One of them was called Almaville. The other was a little tune that he'd been noodling on since 1958 called Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Guaraldi wanted Fate on the B side of the single. Now, as one of his later drummers, Jerry Granelli, loves to tell this particular side of this story, Max Weiss wanted nothing to do with Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Absolutely did not want that song on the B-side of the single. Guaraldi pitched a fit, Granelli loves to tell. He stood on Max's desk, he threw stuff. In the end, Max finally capitulated. The album and the single came out in April of 1962. The album did pretty well on the jazz album charts. The single rapidly went nowhere. Months passed. Then in the summer of 1962, a DJ at a Sacramento pop station received the single in the mail, played the A-side, liked it, caught the title of the tune on the B-side, Cast Your Fate to the Wind, thought that was a pretty cool title. So he flipped it over, played the song, played it again, liked it so much that he started including it in his rotation on a pop station every opportunity he had. Now, pop stations in those days had very strict rules about how often you could and could not play the same single song. But this was an instrumental, and this guy was crafty. So at the end of every hour, when you've only got about 1 minute, 2 minutes before you lead up to the station ID and sometimes the news, not enough time for a whole song, right? Well, he'd play Fade again and just fade it out. So it seemed like people in the Sacramento area were hearing Cast Your Fate to the Wind quite a lot. About the time the station manager got wind of this and was just about to tell his DJ off, he decided that he liked the song, and he made it a station pick. So, from Sacramento to San Francisco to Los Angeles, in the space of about 3 weeks, Guaraldi finally gets a call from Fantasy Records one day, late in the summer of 1962, and here's the 3 words that every musician longed to hear in those days: "We've got action." Now, mind you, keep the timeline in mind here. Dropped in April, right? We're now in late summer. The song slowly continued to gain momentum, first on the West Coast, then across the country. Fantasy scrambling to produce singles to meet the demand at a rate that they've never encountered before. And there's a famous ad that they took out in Billboard magazine late in 1962, 13 and a half years without a hit, and we finally have one. In December, the song finally entered the Billboard Top Pop chart. December. These days, today, if a song doesn't hit in the first 3 days, it's history. So we're talking about a period of 8 months. Now we're into 1963. The song slowly climbs up the charts, finally peaks at number 22 in the spring. Guaraldi's nominated for a Grammy Award. Best Instrumental Jazz Composition, a category, by the way, which only existed for a very short period of time, so he was lucky. On the night of the Grammys, the ceremony in Beverly Hills, Cast Your Fate to the Wind won the award for Best Instrumental Jazz Composition. And although he had traveled to Los Angeles to be on hand to personally accept the award, Guaraldi was unable to do so because in another Charlie Brown move, he had forgotten to bring his tux, and they wouldn't let him in. He went back to San Francisco. His Grammy Award was mailed to him. So, summer of 1963, 2 things happened simultaneously. Guaraldi's life and career suddenly took action in a couple of different directions. I'll cover one of them real briefly, and then we'll get to the one which brings us here today. A young TV director-producer by the name of Lee Mendelson had just finished a documentary on baseball great Willie Mays. It had done well on TV in the ratings. He was looking around, trying to think of a subject for his second documentary. And as he would later say, well, you know, I had just done a show about the world's best baseball player, so I thought maybe it was time to do one about the world's worst baseball player. That, of course, being Charlie Brown. So he got in touch with Charles Schulz, who liked the idea, and they set about making plans to do a 1-hour documentary, which was to be called A Boy Named Charlie Brown, which would be primarily live-action footage following Charles Schulz through a typical day. But Mendelssohn wanted some animation, and at that point in time, an animator by the name of Bill Melendez had done very well with a series of short TV commercial spots using the Peanuts characters to advertise Ford Falcons. Anybody remember those? Little black and white spots? You can find them on YouTube. They're adorable. Mendelssohn knew that he wanted some jazz. First, he contacted one of his buddies, Cal Tjader, who turned him down. Then he contacted another of his, a little further colleagues, Dave Brubeck, who turned him down, and also kind of subtly suggested that even the invitation was somewhat beneath him. I should mention that Brubeck, years later, did in fact score a Peanuts TV special. So Lee is driving across the Golden Gate Bridge one day, listening to a jazz station, and what do you suppose came on over the radio? Cast Your Fate to the Wind. He gets off the freeway, has to find a payphone. You had to do that in those days. Places a bunch of calls, finds out that Guaraldi's the guy to get in touch with, finds him, offers him the job. Guaraldi accepts. Guaraldi, Schulz, Mendelssohn, Melendez all get together, produce what I'm told would have been a marvelous 1-hour documentary blending live action and animation. They couldn't sell it. Nobody wanted to see Charlie Brown on TV. CBS turned him down, ABC turned him down, NBC turned him down. Hey, in those days, that was it. Well, the happy ending to that story is that a little bit later, one of the advertising reps who had seen that film was handling the Coca-Cola account, came back to Mendelssohn, offered them the opportunity to do a Peanuts Christmas show. And the rest from there, as we all know, is history. But let's go back to late 1963. A young Episcopalian priest by the name of Charles Gompertz, 27 years old, picked up the newspaper one day, this was a Saturday, and saw a photo of his boss, Bishop Pike, in one of those obviously staged photo ops with a group of typical teenagers. This was the time period when Grace Cathedral in San Francisco was nearing completion. A very big deal, both in San Francisco, across the country, and indeed throughout the world. An entire year of grace was being scheduled to help celebrate this event. This photo op referenced what was, in Bishop Pike's mind, one of the events that they were going to hold in the interests of attracting the youth element to the church. And Bishop Pike was quoted as saying, "Yes, we're going to stage a holy hootenanny." And Chuck, Charles Gompertz, saw that caption under the photo that morning, picked up the phone rather impetuously, called his boss, Bishop Pike, said, "Bishop, I just don't think that that sets the right tone for the type of event that we're attempting to put together here." And Pike, one to act impulsively himself, said, "Okay, fine. You come up with something else. I'll give you a date in May 1965. I expect you to fill the cathedral. Have a good day." Chuck turns to his wife and says, "That's it, my career's over." So he did what many of us do at moments of crisis. He drew himself a warm bath. He's lounging in the water, leaning back. His wife has the radio on in the other room. You're ahead of me, right? What do you suppose came on the radio? Now, I don't believe in coincidence, but I figure, I've gotten to know Lee Mendelssohn pretty well, and I mean, my goodness, Chuck Gompertz, an Episcopalian priest, would he lie? Please. So he hears this song on the radio. Now, he doesn't know what it's called. He calls to his wife, "What is this? What am I listening to?" His wife says, it's that Cast Your Fate to the Wind song." Chuck thinks, "Well, that's what I've just done." So but he likes the music. So he gets up and he makes a phone call. He knows somebody, he has a friend who works at a record store. The friend knows somebody at Fantasy Records. So Chuck gets the phone number at Fantasy Records. This is all on a Saturday morning, mind you. Calls Fantasy Records. Max Weiss answers. Chuck outlines a plan that he's kind of making up as he's going along. Jazz, mass, blend of jazz, da-da-da-da-da. Max says, oh, okay, let me give you Guaraldi's number. Chuck calls the Guaraldi home. Guaraldi's wife, Shirley, answers. He discusses all of this with her. She says, well, I don't know, but let me go get Vince. Agonizing, 2, 3, 4 minutes pass. Chuck's waiting on the phone. Vince gets on and says, it sounds interesting. Let's meet for lunch next week. Why don't you come to the Trident? I'm currently performing there in sort of a supper club in Sausalito, just outside San Francisco. They have a lunch meeting. Chuck outlines the plan, which has taken shape in his mind in the intervening couple of days. Guaraldi listens to all of this very quietly and thoughtfully, and then he says, well, you know, Bach, Brahms, Beethoven, they all wrote masses. Why not me? Thus began what was to become an 18-month process from late 1963 through May 21st, 1965, when the completed Vince Guaraldi Jazz Mass was presented at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. During those 18 months, Guaraldi worked with the full choir at St. Paul's Church in San Rafael, a mixed adult children's choir. They met every Saturday morning for 3 hours from 8 until 11. There was always a break midway. All the adults would go off in one direction and smoke. Guaraldi liked to hang out with the kids, and they loved him because he was a small guy. He was kind of their size. And there's one wonderful story that is told by one of the then children, now adults, whom I've gotten to know, involving a skateboard. One of the boys there had a skateboard, and Guaraldi was enchanted by this. And one Saturday morning during the break, Guaraldi asked to borrow the skateboard and started tearing down the hill. And I should mention that this St. Paul's Church is indeed on a rather steep hill. And so the church rector, Father John Riley, went tearing after him, screaming at him to stop because he didn't want him to fall and break his hands. Guaraldi never fell. So, as the date approached, Guaraldi brought the other members of his trio in. At that time, it was Tom Beeson on bass and Lee Charlton on drums, and they began to work both on Saturdays and on Wednesday evenings. And the choir director, Barry Minia, had a very firm instruction for his singers. He said, you will have noticed by now, despite all of the work that we've done collaboratively, that Mr. Guaraldi never plays anything the same way twice. I'm sure it's going to be worse when his trio members get here. You, on the other hand, must always sing exactly the same as we have learned here. Now, this was tremendously difficult, and I know Bill can speak to this with more musical authority, but again, as recounted by some of the choir members, they found it very hard to ignore what was happening in the other corner because, of course, it was fun. And it was very hard not to start bopping. As significant as Guaraldi's career is in terms of what he did for the Peanuts franchise, for which most certainly he will forever be known in the first sentence. You never hear Vince Guaraldi's name without it being followed in a positive that goes something along the lines of composer and performer of the music for the early Peanut specials. Wouldn't take that accolade away from him for a moment, but I would argue that what he did with his Jazz Mass when it was presented on May 21st, 1965, is in many ways much more important, because what is crucial to the telling of this story, and what Charles Gompertz knew full well when he had proposed this idea back in late 1963, was that up until this moment, believe it or not, jazz had never, ever been presented or performed during a church service in the United States. Guaraldi broke that ground. It was a brave thing at the time. The 1960s were a tempestuous period, and Guaraldi got there first. Grace Cathedral staff was reluctantly obliging at best, but of course, success breeds an entirely different sort of response, and it's important to note that just a couple of months after Guaraldi's Jazz Mass broke this ground, Grace Cathedral somehow found itself in the position of inviting no less than Duke Ellington to come and perform. And I'll close by saying that in yet another Charlie Brown moment, when Bill and I were at Grace Cathedral a couple of weeks ago for a concert presentation of much of that music, my wife and I arrived early, and I wandered into the Grace Cathedral gift shop, and they had one of those little standing racks of CDs near the cash register. So I was idly flipping through them, and I found several copies of the Duke Ellington performance that took place in Grace in 1965, and would you believe, of course you would, I'm building up to it, they did not have a copy of Guaraldi's Jazz Mass. I registered a stern complaint. I doubt anybody cared. And I thank you for your attention.